One of the most urgent tasks for our country is to decisively defeat the climate hysteria hoax.
We are in the beginning of a mass extinction.
The ability of CO₂ to do the heavy work of creating a climate catastrophe is almost nil at this point.
The price of oil has been artificially elevated to the point of insanity.
That's not how you power a modern industrial system.
The ultimate goal of this renewable energy, plan is to reach the exact same point that we're at now.
You know who's tried that? Germany. 7 straight days of no wind for Germany. Their factories are shutting down.
They really do act like weather didn't happen prior to 1910.
Today is Friday.
That's right, Greta. It is Friday. It is the best day of the week, and not just because the weekend is almost here, because it's the day that the Heartland Institute broadcasts the Climate Realism Show. My name is Jim Lakely. I'm the Vice President of the Heartland Institute. We are an organization that has been around for 40 years and is known as the leading global think tank pushing back on climate alarmism. Heartland and this show bring you the data, the science, the truth, and sometimes when we're very lucky, some very special guests to counter the alarmist narrative you've been fed every single day of your life. There is nothing else quite like the Climate Realism Show streaming anywhere. So I hope you will bring friends to this live stream every Friday at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. And also like, share, and subscribe. And also leave your comments underneath this video. All of these very simple tasks help convince YouTube's algorithm to smile upon this program and get it in front of even more people. And as a reminder, because big tech and the legacy media do not really approve of the way we cover climate and energy on this program, Heartland's YouTube channel has been demonetized. So if you want to support the program, please visit heartland.org/TCRS. That's heartland.org/TCRS. And you can join other friends of the program who contribute to help bring this show to the world every week. Any support you can give is warmly welcome and greatly appreciated. And we also want to thank our streaming partners, junkscience.com, CFACT, What's Up With That, the CO₂ Coalition, and Heartland UK Europe. I hope you will find and follow all of these accounts on your favorite social media and video outlets. We got a big show today and a very special guest, so let's get started. Today we have with us, as usual, Anthony Watts. He's a senior fellow at the Heartland Institute and the publisher of the world's most viewed website on climate change, What's Up With That? We have Sterling Burnett, the Archbishop of Canterbury, also the director of the Arthur B. Robinson Center on Climate Change, on Climate and Environmental Policy at the Heartland Institute, and Linnea Lueken, Research Fellow for Energy and Environment Policy at Heartland. And our producer, Andy Singer, is absent today, but we want to thank Keely and Ian for helping to make this show look and flow so great from behind the curtain. And we want to welcome back to the program today a friend of the show and a friend of ours, Dr. Will Happer. Will Happer, PhD, is a physicist who has specialized in the interaction of atoms and nuclei with radiation. He's the Cyrus Fogg Brackett Professor of Physics Emeritus at Princeton University and a long-term member of the Jason Advisory Group, where he pioneered the development of adaptive optics and invented the sodium guide star to eliminate astronomical image blurring due to atmospheric turbulence. That's quite an accomplishment, Dr. Happer. And you're also the winner of the Frederick Seitz Memorial Award in 2015 at the Heartland's International Conference on Climate Change that we held that year. And very, very, very warm welcome to the program today, Will.
Thanks, Jim.
So let's see. So we're going to get to your paper. You wrote a very, we thought, very interesting paper, and I think it's worth sharing with our audience today. But first, let's bring everyone up here on screen, please. Oops, missed that one. Yep. We're going to start the show as we usually do with a segment called The Crazy Climate News of the Week. Hit the video, Keely.
You got to deal with this climate change.
All right. Thank you very much, Bill Nye, for introducing our Crazy Climate News of the Week every single week. Our first item today that we wanted to cover in climate news is we've titled it Joe Rogan versus Bernie Sanders. Socialist Senator Bernie Sanders was on the Joe Rogan Experience this week. That's the most watched podcast in the world. and it was a pretty interesting appearance. For one, Joe was a Bernie bro before his friends on the left, as well as the media, savaged him for his unorthodox views on vaccines and lockdowns and, his own personal medical choices and his dedication to free speech. So anyway, he brought on, his the politician he probably most admired, Bernie Sanders, and it didn't go great for old Bernie, I think. They had a wide-ranging discussion, but we wanted to pull out this clip of Joe using some data on the climate to push back on Bernie's apocalyptic and scientifically baseless claims that humans are causing catastrophic global warming and an increase in cataclysmic weather events. So let's hit that clip, please.
Climate change issue. And I know that, there are some people who think climate change is a hoax. It ain't a hoax. I think the last 10 years have been the warmest on record. And we can create millions of good-paying jobs transforming our energy system away from fossil fuel to energy efficiency, to solar, to wind, and other sustainable energies.
I think the climate change issue is very complicated. And I think, did you see the Washington Post piece that they wrote where they did this long-term view? First of all, the reality is that the Earth's temperature has never been static, right? We could both agree on that. It's always been up and down. There's been ice ages and heat waves. And then the Washington Post looked at it. What was the time period that they looked at? That essentially they found that we're in a cooling period. That the Earth over the past X amount of years, and this was like a very inconvenient discovery, but they had to report the data, and kudos to them for doing that. Scientists have captured the Earth's climate change over the last 485 million years. Here's a surprising place we stand now. So look at the far end of that graph, and you see we're in a cooling period.
Well, I'm not sure. I didn't read that article, but
Yeah.
The scientists who are out there, I think.
I know, but there's a lot of money involved in that too, Bernie. That's part of the problem. There's a lot of money involved in this whole climate change emergency issue, and there's a lot of control, and that's a big part of this problem. Not only that, if we're just talking about primarily carbon and carbon footprint, what are we going to do about China? Because China is like, what percentage of
They are the major polluter right now in terms of carbon. We're number two. We used to be one. They are number one right now.
I think they have an enormous percent of the global. I think it's
they're number one. I don't know what
very
the percent
high.
is.
It's very high.
It's not an American issue. It is a global issue. And all I can tell you is that we are, in my view, going to see more extreme weather disturbances in the coming years than we have ever. And we're seeing them right now.
Right, but scientists don't agree. Well, this is where it gets confusing, because scientists that are in agreement, there's all these entanglements. Whenever someone's discussing something, whether it's economics or whether it's health issues or pharmaceutical drugs, there's financial entanglements. I think we both agree with that, right?
Yep.
And I think this is part of the issue with this whole climate change emergency as well.
Yeah. So that's enough of that clip. Thank you so much, Ian. So, Linnea, you actually alerted me to this week, and you actually on X, you noted that this maybe marks a major shift happening in the discussion of global warming, but we need to be, careful not to blow it, is the way you put it. So why don't you kind of walk through what your thinking is there?
Oh, sure. So this is the fact that you can have a major podcaster who's not necessarily, some kind of like right-wing, like identitarian type commenting on the climate issue. Someone who is like, that's not his main wheelhouse. It's not something that Rogan talks about all the time, but he's aware that there are, as he put it, entanglements when it comes to funding, and in people claiming that there's a lot more of a consensus than there actually is, people claiming that, the science is settled when it actually isn't. The fact that he's aware of it and he's willing to not just mention it on the podcast, but actually actively push back on Bernie Sanders for making those kind of, empty claims that he was making. I think that indicates that there is a tone shift in the general culture against this climate stuff. And I think part of it is probably because the alarmists went too far, I think, with trying to attribute, especially with the rapid attribution stuff, trying to attribute absolutely every single thing to climate change and trying to say, you know, climate change makes everything bad and nothing is ever good from it. You know, there's no benefit. It's all detriment. And we need to install global socialism right now. Like it becomes very transparent that this is just them using climate change as a vehicle to push policies that they would want regardless of whether or not, you know, there was global warming. So I think people are beginning to see that, and they're beginning to talk about it more openly. But I do think that we could mess it up. I think that we could blow our kind of momentum that we've got going on this if we are to take it too far in the other direction and say things like, you know, there is no, like, climate change actually doesn't exist, like that kind of insanity, or you know, attributing every single storm or something to like geoengineering. I think that would be a major mistake. So that's what I mean by like, don't blow it. we're beginning to win on the science and on the like public perception angle here. So you know, taking it into a direction where it's not, you know, the science does not support what we're saying would not be so good for us.
Yeah. Anthony Watts, sometimes the hardest thing in life is to take yes for an answer. And I think that's one thing we need to do on this thing.
Yeah. You know, I would point out that our position has been and will continue to be on climate change that yes, it's happening. No, it's not a crisis. And anyone who says it's a crisis is inflating it either for personal gain, political gain, or somehow some scientific gain. The idea that you know, climate change is going to swoop down out of the skies in form of weather and destroy us is absolutely bunk, and we've debunked it many, many times on Climate Realism.
Yeah, yeah. So, Ian, if you could bring up the slideshow, I have a chart here. I want to throw it to Sterling and to Dr. Happer here, just to kind of correct something. What struck me in that clip was I thought Bernie Sanders was being disingenuous. I actually don't believe that he didn't see that story. I don't believe that he doesn't know how much China contributes to human CO₂ emissions compared to the United States. And there's a couple charts here that I wanted to mention. Maybe we can make that bigger, Ian. But here, there you go. Thank you. So this is annual CO₂ emissions. This is from our world in data. And fossil fuels and industry and land use is not included. China, 12 billion tons of carbon dioxide emissions, and the United States is around 5 billion tons of CO₂ emissions. That's quite a lot more than us. And it's just not that China is ahead of us and we used to be number one. It is not even in the same neighborhood. And then the slide after that, Ian, this is coal consumption. And China consumes nearly 13 times as much coal as the United States does. And so I think, you know, Joe Rogan didn't have those facts on hand, but we have them on hand here to show that, you know, this idea that if the United States gives up coal, gives up fossil fuels, you know, reduces our CO₂ to net zero, which we're going to get to with Dr. Happer here later, that it would have any impact on the world when you consider what China is doing. Sterling?
Well, I'm not going to call Bernie Sanders a liar. I suspect he didn't see that chart because he doesn't look at evidence. He made up his mind. He's got his echo chamber. He listens to the people he listens to, and anything outside of that about global cooling over time, he ignores or is never told because his assistants don't tell him about this stuff. So I don't think he didn't know about the chart. I think he didn't know about the chart. Now, concerning China, he admitted that they're the major polluter. Does he know the actual numbers? I don't know. But in the end, since I don't consider, I honestly don't care where China is in relation to the U.S. or the U.S. in relation to the world, because I'm not concerned about CO₂ emissions. I don't call them pollution.
Right.
They're not toxic at any foreseeable level. And so, you know, getting on Bernie Sanders for not knowing facts, that's like, you know, you could say that about any politician almost. Most of them don't care about most evidence They care about what the talking points they're given to them.
Yeah. Dr. Happer, you're the founding member of the CO₂ Coalition, which is one of our streaming partners. So when you see this chart that China is, emitting that much more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere than the United States, what's your reaction to that? Is that good?
I think it's very good for the people of China. It's brought unimagined prosperity to a country that was once mired in poverty. And now there's a huge middle class. People are living very well. They have good jobs. They have good housing. And all of that is driven by affordable, reliable energy, almost all of which comes from coal. So what's wrong with that? Sterling is absolutely right that CO₂ is not pollution at all. I don't know why Bernie Sanders calls China the number one polluter, or the US used to be the number one polluter. Adding CO₂ to the world is a good thing for the world.
Amen. Yeah, and Linnea and I on the podcast yesterday kind of joked about that. We still got to work on that messaging by people who agree with us on stuff to stop calling carbon dioxide pollution. It's not pollution at all.
Yeah, it was Ted Cruz that was calling it pollution.
Yeah, but even Ted Cruz can't get it right. We got work to do, and we'll continue to do it. All right. Our next item here, this comes from our friend and colleague here, Anthony Watts, and it's global warming and clouds. This is from his website. What's up with that? Bombshell. Study reveals climate warming driven by receding cloud cover. Now, Anthony, this is, like I said, from your website. Just like last week, it's a post written by Charles Rotter, who I know is in the audience. Hello, Charles. And I'm going to read a bit to our audience and then let you run with it here. Charles is commenting on a paper published on June 8th in Geophysical Research Letters, a peer-reviewed journal of scientific literature. The paper is titled Contraction of the World's Storm Cloud Zones, the Primary Contributor to the 21st Century Increase in Earth's Sunlight Absorption. Charles calls it, quote, a fascinating and deeply problematic addition to the climate science canon. And I'll read a bit here of what Charles wrote. It offers yet another reminder that so-called settled science in climate modeling is anything but settled. In fact, it inadvertently illustrates how fragile the predictive power of climate models is, especially when fundamental atmospheric processes like cloud coverage are shown to be both more dynamic and less understood than previously claimed. Not that any of this is news to What's Up With That readers. Dr. Roy Spencer has been noting almost identical observations for more than a decade. And then here's the plain language summary, unquote, of the paper. Analysis of satellite observations shows that in the past 24 years, the Earth's storm cloud zones in the tropics and the middle latitudes have been contracting at a rate of 1.5% to 3% per decade. This cloud contraction, along with cloud cover, decreases at low latitudes, allows more solar radiation to reach the Earth's surface. When the contribution of all cloud changes is calculated, the storm cloud contraction is found to be the main contributor to the observed increase of the Earth's solar absorption during the 21st century. Now, Anthony, can you please walk us through what this means and how important this discovery may turn out to be?
Well, I will point out that Dr. Roy Spencer had posited this back in 2020, and he published a couple of items on it, and it made great sense. He's basically saying that just a couple of percent of cloud cover change can be responsible for all of the climate warming we've seen in the 21st century, or at least the later part of the 21st century. We've seen also a reduction in aerosols, and so that lets more sunlight in. So ever since the EPA was formed in 1970, we've seen a reduction in real pollution, such as sulfates and other types of pollutants that actually reflect sunlight in the air back into space. So we've got clearer air on one count. The second count, we've got less clouds reflecting sunlight back into space. So the combination of those two can easily explain the warming that we've seen over the past 50 years or so. Yet the climate science cabal, so to speak, continues to insist, no, it's nothing but carbon dioxide, you dang climate deniers. Get your head out of your butts. That's really what they think about it. But the problem is that climate science has become beholden to one idea, and that idea is that carbon dioxide is the control knob for Earth's climate. Well, it's not, and we've seen this time and time again. And so when we see a peer-reviewed paper like this, it's not coming from someone on the skeptical side. It really is going to have to start putting the brakes on some of these things. At least we hope so. At the same time, we saw a publication this week that the New York Times glommed onto, basically saying that global warming is accelerating at a record pace. Well, that's all due to the big bump that we saw last year and the year before, due to the Hunga Tonga eruption and its effects on the atmosphere. And so, but they're still blaming carbon dioxide. It's like they've got scientific blinders on. They can't see outside anything beyond carbon dioxide, and it's really sad. As Judith Curry said a couple of days ago, climate science has become pseudoscience because of this kind of ridiculous focus on one thing.
Yeah, there's a lot of, look, we've had a temperature rise. The source of it is probably not just one thing. Cloud cover is probably part of it. The UHI, urban heat island effect, is probably, and density is probably part of it. Undiscovered sources of carbon dioxide are probably part of it. I mean, almost every week in Climate Change Weekly, I publish a study that adds more confusion, I think, or lends credence to the claim that there's a lot of uncertainty remaining out there, that humans are the sole or even are the primary cause of climate change. So, it's not just sulfur dioxide and the emissions from ships that have declined. Particulates, which clouds form around, have declined. I think there's multi-pronged reasons, a number of factors that have contributed to the present warming cycle. That doesn't mean that the present warming cycle will continue for all time, and almost certainly it won't continue for all time. The climate changes, and it has always changed throughout history.
Yeah. I mean, Dr. Happer, you've given many presentations at Heartland's climate conferences over the years. And I recall you not being very impressed by a lot of the climate modeling that's going on out there. And that I wonder if you, and one of the things, I don't know if it's you that's always said this, but a lot of the scientists have made the point to me that a lot of this modeling, and people seem to discount the idea of clouds, like it can't really be modeled. And so what are your thoughts?
Well, of course, clouds are extremely difficult to model, but I agree with everything that's been said. I think it's almost certain that the majority of the warming we've seen in the last few decades has been from more sunlight getting through clouds and particulates and real pollution. There's hard evidence from that around the world. For example, I just recently saw a paper from the south of Poland where they had measured the number of cloud-free days over several decades, and they're getting fewer and fewer cloudy days. Same in the Netherlands. And so there's massive evidence that supports that much of the warming is probably due to less cloudiness. And, I think if you look at the literature, people have speculated in the past that perhaps the reason for the little ice age, in the 1500s, 1600s, was that the Earth on average was a lot more cloudy then than now. It's hard to go back that far and get hard data, but we have pretty good data for the last 50 years, and it supports the cloud idea.
Interesting. I know some people in the comments were expressing shock that something like this could be published in the peer-reviewed literature, but every once in a while you slip one past the goalie, and it's good to see actual science trying to be attempted out there in the public sphere. All right, we have we'll go on to our next segment, which requires a video drop. Keely, if you would.
Wait a minute. You must be the... That's right, gringo. The killer bees.
Yes. Oh no. Maybe the most famous.
That was Elliot Gould's best work.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Probably one of the most famous skits that wasn't Mr. Bill from the early days of SNL. So, all right. So this item for the rundown was picked out by our own Sterling Burnett for this week. And the killer bees are back. This is the story from the Mirror UK. Headline: Terrifying map reveals 13 states invaded by killer bees that swarm by the hundreds and chase cars for miles. Wow. I'll read a bit from it, this fun story. As climate change raises temperatures around the world, the killer bees may soon be able to survive in even more U.S. states. Africanized honeybees, also known as killer bees, have been found in 13 states and are reportedly spreading toward the north of the United States as they attack people and animals on the way. The Africanized honeybee is much more aggressive than the European honeybee, which is the most common subspecies in the U.S. Rather than isolated attacks, the killer bees swarm in vast numbers and can sting victims thousands of times in a short period. The bees do not have more potent stinger venom than regular honeybees. America is used to, the ones that we're used to. And getting stung by one even feels the same as being stung by a regular bee. So I guess it's just that they're very aggressive. Now, Sterling, it's your fault we're even covering this story. So, and you live in Texas, in killer bee country. So how are you even still alive?
Well, first off, when I hear they're chasing cars, I think to myself of cars I pull up next to at a light where they've got their windows rolled down and their bass turned up and it's thumping. My suspicion is those are the cars that they are chasing for miles. And if that's the case, I applaud the killer bees. That interferes with my enjoyment of driving. Look, the killer bees are the once and future threat. There's no place in the United States that killer bees couldn't survive in the 70s that they can suddenly survive in now. I've lived with them. The people in Arizona have lived with them. We've all lived with them. They're not getting more, they're not spreading to new places. They were introduced not by climate change, but by trade, actually. They didn't just come up from South America or Africa across the pond. They came in with fruits and vegetables, and they will be around for all time now, because I don't think we can get rid of them without also doing danger to bees that we like. So this is just a continuation of the climate change causes everything bad narrative. And every so often they have to rehash a really old one. I mean, that clip from SNL, when was that?
1975.
1975. Many of our listeners may not have been alive in 1975, but the BBC's publicizing this as if it's oh my God, this is brand new. I watched 3 movies, because I'm a horror movie fan, back when I was a kid, about the killer bees and how terrible they were going to be and how they're going to take over the world back in the 70s. This isn't new, and it's not dramatic or alarming.
Yeah.
I'm hoping that the Trump administration, maybe Kristi Noem, will announce that they're going to sick ICE on the Mexican killer bees and have them all exported. And then we'll see the left jumping on the bandwagon. Save the killer bees! Save the killer bees!
That's true.
Yeah.
Yep. Well, it's that the point of that being, and we do, Dr. Happer, we call it the crazy climate news of the week. Not all the news we cover is crazy, but it does seem to be pretty crazy that seems to be no shortage of things to blame on human carbon dioxide emissions causing global warming, including killer bees.
If I can comment on this,
Sure.
One of my jobs when I was in high school in Appalachia was I worked for a commercial beekeeper. So I know a lot more about bees and killer bees too than most of these reporters. And the only major effect the killer bees had was they turned countries like Brazil and Paraguay into tropics from, basically impossible to raise bees there to honey exporters. So it greatly decreased the price of honey around the world because, the killer bees were now producing honey where you couldn't produce it before. But they're like any other bees. If you go to a bee yard with 100 hives of bees, there are 2 or 3 there any day that are worse than any killer bee you can find. They vary just like people. Some are mean and some are gentle.
Yeah. Well, I'm actually amazed, actually not amazed, that the amount of expertise when we have people on this. I never would have pegged you as a bee expert, Will Happer, because that is really your area of academic expertise. But what do you know? That's pretty awesome stuff. Cool. All right. Let's move on. We're going to get to we're going to get to. Oh, and by the way, I'll just add this to the stage because we're going to put a slide up here in a minute. But this is the scary map, of terror, and the hot zones are where the killer bees are. So, to our friends in Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona, we're praying for you. Please be safe out there. All right, and we have our meme of the week, which I'm going to post up on here. If you could make that bigger for us, Ian, I'd appreciate it. Thank you. So there's this reporter for the New York Times, the climate reporter, brand new climate reporter at the New York Times. Used to be at E&E News Update, and then also at the Washington Post. And it's the old "how it started, how it's going" meme. And so she put out a post on X saying, "I just started as a climate change reporter at the New York Times, and this is what job security looks like." And it's the weather forecast on her phone with a high of 99 degrees, and then a high of 97, and then a high of 92, and then it's in 84, 91, whatever. And she was getting ripped about this on X because she chose to share it publicly. And then so she now doesn't let anybody look at her posts that isn't a friend of hers. Her posts are now protected. So that's how
the
it
New York
goes.
Times. The New York Times, all the news that's fit to hide.
That's true.
Protected from scrutiny is what you're protected from.
Yep, for sure. All right. Well, thank you all for your indulgence on our fun segment there. Well, all the segments are fun, and this one is going to be fun and informative. We'll get on with our main topic with our very special guest, Dr. Will Happer. Now, Dr. Happer, you authored a paper with your friend and ours, Richard Lindzen. He's professor of Earth, Atmospheric, and Planetary Sciences Emeritus at MIT. And you titled it, quote, "Physics demonstrates that increasing greenhouse gases cannot cause dangerous warming, extreme weather, or any harm." And your subhead states, quote, "More carbon dioxide will create more food. Driving greenhouse gas emissions to net zero and eliminating fossil fuels will be disastrous for people worldwide." And before you even get into the meat of this 46-page paper, you and Dr. Lindzen have a section addressing what you've seen in your long careers as, I guess, the decline of the scientific method that puts so-called consensus over rigorous and honest inquiry and challenge in your field. And that is important, and we will certainly get to that. But I want to state for the audience the three sections that I wanted to discuss here. Number one, ignored science number one. CO2 and other greenhouse gases and fossil fuels will not cause catastrophic global warming and more extreme weather. Ignored science number two, there will be disastrous consequences for humanity, especially the poor, if we continue to pursue net zero. And then a third item, subhead, EPA endangerment finding and net zero, and that both are based on politics and not science and data. So, this paper, Dr. Happer, is full of great science and data, and it's maybe difficult to decide where we should start. But maybe we start with what prompted you and Dick Lindzen to author this paper together anyway.
Well, in the interest of full disclosure, we have a friend, Charles Weller, who helped us to write this. He's an attorney, and he says, "You scientists don't know how to talk to the general public. Let me help you, put together a narrative that the average person will understand and appreciate." And so we owe a lot to Chuck for helping us on this piece of paper. But everything in it is true. It's quotes from writings that Dick Lindzen and I have done over the years. Mm-hmm. And there's not much controversial about it. I mean, even the IPCC, for example, doesn't claim there's any increase of extreme weather. If you actually read their reports, it's not there. They can't find any evidence in spite of huge motivations to find it. It's just not there. And that's not surprising because the main greenhouse gas that people are worried about, carbon dioxide, is a very puny greenhouse gas. It doesn't make much difference if you double CO2. It only decreases radiation to space by 1%. So 100% increase CO2, 1% effect on radiation to space, on cooling. And so, it's just unbelievable that they've managed to puff up this molehill into this enormous mountain of CO2 alarmism that dominates so much of the world today. The Chinese don't buy it. Good for them.
Yeah.
And Indians don't buy it, and And I hope sooner or later our friends in this country will come to their senses and begin to reject all this nonsense themselves.
Yeah, well, Will, there's I want to pick down a little bit into this ignored science number one about CO2. Your paper states that there's a section 600 million years of CO2 and temperature data contradict the theory that high levels of CO2 will cause catastrophic global warming. And you also make the point that today's approximately 425 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere is actually very low and not dangerously high. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, yes, we are able to estimate amounts of CO2 in the geological past by various proxy measurements. It typically involves looking at the ratios of the two carbon isotopes, 12 and 13, both of them stable, not radioactive, so they can last for hundreds of millions of years. And all of that evidence points to much higher CO2 levels in the past, at the beginning of, the modern era of the Cambrian, when we started getting good fossils and sediments, CO2 levels were, 10 times, 20 times higher than they are now. They were many thousands of parts per million. And yet the Earth was verdant and green and supported lots of life. And so plants really evolved in much higher CO2 levels than they are today. And you can see plants all around the world flourishing compared to what they were 100 years ago. And that's not surprising because they've really been living in a CO2 famine for the last 10 million years or so. And it's gradually beginning to be broken thanks to the release of CO2 from burning fossil fuels. And so there's absolutely nothing wrong with this. If you go to, say, Canada, most greenhouses in Canada where they grow tomatoes, I like Canadian greenhouse tomatoes, but they're grown in high levels of CO2. And that costs money. The CO2 isn't free, but it's worth paying for the CO2 for the greenhouse because you get such better products and you get a better price for what you produce. So the whole thing is an amazing popular delusion, as the title of an ancient book went, but it is a delusion. It's not true. None of it's true. There is no crisis.
Yeah. I want to say, Will, though, I do think that what China and India do behind their borders, and China, when it exports technology, and what they say in public is two different things. You indicated that they don't think it's a crisis. Well, that's not what they say in public. They go to these meetings and they say, oh, yes, we've got to do something about CO2, and you go first. This is, what Trump always calls the climate hoax. China, India, oh, you guys caused the problem. You've got to correct your stuff and we'll catch up sometime. We'll eventually hit net zero, but you've got to go first. So they say it's a problem and then they just don't act like it's a problem. It's like, I don't know, if I was a climate negotiator, let's just call me, my initials are JK. And I flow around the globe on private planes, but I tell you that your coach flying is the problem with climate change, not my private jet use. It's hypocrisy.
Yeah, of course, Sterling, there's lots of hypocrisy. And, the first requirement to be a good diplomat is to be able to lie with a straight face. And they're pretty good at that. So are ours. It goes with the territory. But I think realistically, if you look at their actions, that's what counts. And both China and India are going full bore for coal. It's the best, most economic, most reliable way to produce energy. And of course, you have to do it in the right way. Coal really does release real pollutants. Anthony Watts mentioned, oxides of sulfur and nitrogen and fly ash. But you can actually build plants for which that's completely negligible. I remember visiting the the Turk plant in Texarkana, I guess Texas or Arkansas, I'm not sure, but it's absolutely clean. There's nothing coming out of the stacks. And China is building hundreds of plants like that. So their air is getting cleaner, even though they're building more and more coal plants. They are retiring the old coal plants that are polluting and crude and not all that efficient, with these new plants that have very little pollution and have much higher efficiency in turning the heat energy from the coal into electrical energy for the population. So we're missing out on all of that. We could have been part of that, but we're not.
Yeah. So I wanted to let's get into that ignored science number 2 bit of the paper that I'd highlighted here for our audience, and the idea that there will be disastrous consequences for humanity and especially the poor if basically the Western world and the Western world alone continues to pursue net zero.
Well, if you try to run a modern country on so-called renewables, wind and solar, it really doesn't work. First of all, the only thing they can produce is electricity, and we use a lot of fossil fuels for example, transportation, for airplanes, for our automobiles, and if you want a profitable country, one where there are jobs for people, you have to be able to produce goods and services at a price that people are willing to pay for. And if you're hampered by enormously expensive electrical power and unreliable electrical power, you're not going to produce them in such a country. You'll move to a country like China, where you can be sure you'll have the electrical power you need, because they have the coal power plants and the appropriate grid to provide it for you. I think everyone can see that now from the artificial intelligence movement, because you can't run an artificial intelligence center without using huge amounts of electrical power. And it doesn't take you more than 5 minutes to realize if you try to do that in wind and solar, you're going to be out of business. And so all of the new electrical, all of the discussion about new electrical power is often focused on artificial intelligence. How do you keep these data centers running? And nobody seems to object to that. For example, they're talking about restarting the 3 Mile Island nuclear plant in order to provide electrical power for artificial intelligence in the Pennsylvania area. Lots of jobs. So I don't see anything wrong with that. But it's too bad that we didn't do that a lot sooner than we have. We've wasted a lot of time.
Yeah. Well, and you also mentioned, Dr. Happer, that there is no scientific basis, according to your paper and your long-held views, that there's not a scientific basis for the EPA endangerment finding, which maybe you could explain a little bit to our audience. What is the endangerment finding by EPA, and why there is no scientific justification for them to regulate based on it?
Well, the endangerment finding was a Supreme Court decision, involved a lawsuit from, I guess, the state of Massachusetts and the Environmental Protection Agency. And the Massachusetts, plaintiffs wanted the EPA to regulate CO₂ as a pollutant. We've talked about the inappropriateness of calling CO₂ a pollutant. It's not a pollutant at all, but that's what the state of Massachusetts wanted. And so the EPA sort of punted. It said, well, we'll let the administrator of EPA decide whether CO₂ is a pollutant or not. If you talk to the congressman who passed the Clean Air Act, they were absolutely aghast. They never in their wildest dreams thought anyone would label CO₂ as a pollutant. But EPA did. So under I think the Obama administration, if I remember right, I may be wrong, but so anyway, we're stuck with this decision involving the Supreme Court, the highest court in the land, that's allowed CO₂ to be maligned as a pollutant. It's not really a pollutant at all. So I think it's very important if possible, to get rid of that ruling, the endangerment ruling. And I'm hoping that the current administration will be willing to take the effort to get rid of that. I think they have a good chance of succeeding if they're willing to try. And I think they are trying. So fingers crossed, we should all support their efforts.
Mm-hmm.
I think so
Yeah,
too.
the EPA, to some extent, the EPA, I won't say they were in a bind, but the Supreme Court didn't allow it. They said under a reasonable definition of pollution, CO2 is a pollution because anything emitted into the air is a pollutant. Anything humans put out, they said, is a pollutant. And they said EPA's only job is to determine whether it's a pollutant that endangers human health or welfare in the environment. And then if it does, to set about regulating it. And the EPA under Bush punted, as you say, and the EPA under Obama said, well, no, we've determined how. Well, we referenced the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change saying it's a danger to human health and welfare. We determined it's a pollutant and we've got to start regulating it. And, the disaster started with the Supreme Court saying anything emitted to the air is a pollutant. Now, we've had the major questions doctrine come up in West Virginia v. EPA since then. As Dr. Happer said, the people who wrote the Clean Air Act, CO2 is not mentioned in the Clean Air Act. And the major questions doctrine says, look, if it's a major question and it's not specifically in the law, you got to defer to Congress. So maybe they'll overturn based on that. That's my hope. But it was a nightmare once the court ruled. It dealt with transportation at the time. It wasn't smokestacks. But everyone said, well, if this applies to transportation, it will equally apply to large-scale emissions from power plants and other factories. And of course, we who predicted that were right.
No, you're right. Thanks for that clarification. It requires some courage because anything you do like that will cost you some votes. And so you have to make the calculation, can I get enough support if I go through with this that, we'll still be in power after we've been successful. And so I think they're guessing that that it's okay to go ahead and try and do this. But I don't know. I'm not in the inner circles of making these decisions.
Yeah.
For sure. Well, we have a lot of questions for you, Dr. Happer, as well as other people on the panel. So why don't we just get right to that, Linnea?
Okay.
All right. Okay. So, and this is a question that I wanted to ask you as well, Dr. Happer, and this is, I'm going to reframe this person's question a little bit. We'll answer the way that it was asked, and then I'll reframe it. So we'll pull it up first. Science and Narrative says, people are so amazingly biased, emotional, and fixed. How do you break the wall? How do you fight the psychology of climate?
Well, of course, that's a very important question. We've talked about the motives of people involved in this climate hysteria. And there are many people actually who are simply misled. They're not evil people at all. They think that the earth is in danger because that's all they've heard since they were little children. And if it's in danger, we should try and save it. No sacrifice is too big if the earth is about to die. And so what we're faced with is, deprogramming a cult. There are people who specialize in deprogramming your kids, if they get caught up into some religious cult. And I guess if I were to start doing that, I would enlist some of them to get advice on what works and how do you repair this brainwashing that's gone on since kindergarten. But that's why it's so hard. Nobody likes to admit that they've been misled, that it was all nonsense. It was like like the Easter Bunny or something like that.
I think there's a saying that it's harder to give up a false belief, to get people to give up a false belief that they've long held, than it is to get them to accept the truth or something like that.
Well, isn't the saying that it's easier to fool someone than to get to them to admit they've been fooled, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Maybe the way to do this is to follow the lead of Saturday Night Live, where we get Elliot Gould and some other people to dress up as killer CO2 molecules and show up, in a skit, to show people how ridiculous it is.
Unfortunately,
ridicule is a very powerful weapon, and if we can get people to feel they'll look ridiculous by supporting climate hysteria, then we've won.
So my kind of reframing of that question as well for you, Dr. Happer, is so you work in academia at a very high level and have for a long time. How do you get people in your position to accept that the issue is more complicated than like the media and politicians and stuff promote it as? Because I see from, there are a lot of good scientists who kind of keep their heads down, I think. And it would really help us if they didn't. But what are your thoughts on how we break through in academia?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a good question, Linnea, and I think there is a clear answer to this one, and that is you simply turn off the funding for, climate nonsense, because most of the funding comes from the federal government. So you could turn that faucet off tomorrow, and you'll be amazed at how the enthusiasm for working in this area would disappear when it's clear that you're not going to get funding from Washington. And so you would have to hope that maybe you can think of some other really important things for academics to work on that actually help instead of harm our society, and provide funding for that. And they will flock to it, where there's a honeypot, there will be killer bees.
Happer, are you summarized? Can we summarize this by saying money talks and bullshit walks?
Yeah, you got it. Yeah.
All right. So we also have some good science questions here too. This is from Tom White, who says, Dr. Happer, please explain CO2 saturation, not with illustrations, but with like the scientific description of how it works.
Well, okay. Saturation is a nerdy word that was invented in the astrophysics community, but the things like the Fraunhofer lines of the sun are quite similar to CO2 lines in the Earth, so the physics is the same. And so it's not a word that climate deniers invented. It's a word that came directly out of astrophysics. And so what it says, when you first add a little bit of CO2 to an atmosphere that doesn't have any at all, the first few molecules of CO2 have an easy time causing warming, so they're extremely effective. And as you add more and more molecules to the atmosphere, they start getting into each other's way. All the easy radiation that you'd like to stop from cooling the Earth has already been used up by other CO2 molecules. So pickings get slimmer and slimmer as you add more CO2. So just for example, if the atmosphere were completely free of CO2 and you added a CO2 molecule, it would cause 10,000 times more warming than adding a CO2 molecule today. So the effectiveness of CO2 is down by a factor of 10,000 from no CO2 at all in the atmosphere. There's no question about this. This is it's incontrovertible, if you work through the physics. It's not very hard physics either. And so we're in a region now where CO2 has done almost everything it can. Adding more CO2 does cause a little bit more warming, but not very much. So it's very hard to make the argument that if you double CO2 from 400 parts per million today to 800, that you could get even 1 degree of warming without some miracles happening. The miracles are huge positive feedback, and they're built into all the climate models. So the climate modelers know perfectly well that without enormous positive feedbacks built into the models, that you can't please your paymasters. The Earth won't warm enough to have a crisis to profit from.
And this is related. Tech asks, has NASA looked at that on planets or moons without atmospheres?
Oh, yes. We understand the moon very well. We've got good measurements of the moon, which has no atmosphere to speak of. And the moon does just what you would expect for a planet without an atmosphere. It gets beastly hot, at midday, and a day lasts for a month on the moon. So it's hot for a long time. And then it gets beastly cold at midnight, or just before dawn, when it's facing away from the sun and is radiating into space. And we've got instruments that measure that, thanks to some of the moon landings and also remote measurements. And what you observe on the moon is exactly what you predict.
Excellent. Thank you. All right. This is also related to the saturation point. A lot of people have questions about that.
Yeah.
Kite Man Music says, does it matter how much CO2 China puts into the atmosphere, as it looks as if we have reached saturation? Question for later.
Well, I think it matters in the sense that it will improve the productivity of plants all around the world. You can already see greening of the earth from satellite pictures. And so additional CO2 has been a major benefit to agriculture and to forestry on Earth. And the benefits there are far from saturated. Adding more CO2 now actually has a big effect helping plants as opposed to temperature, where it doesn't make much difference. So yes, more CO2 from China will be a benefit to the world.
This is a question I'm not really sure exactly what they're referring to, but this is from Marcia, who says, what could cause cloud height contraction?
Well, this is really should be something Anthony Watts responded to. This is meteorology, not so much climate, but clouds. There's a cloud condensation level, and so when you have hot air rising, it gets to a certain altitude, and then it turns into clouds. And so anything that would change that cloud condensation level, which has to do with the relative humidity of the parcels of air going up. Anthony, why don't you answer this?
Okay, well, I think that the cloud height contraction is a confusion over the paper that we presented. They were talking about storm fronts and storm areas contracting. Well, this was a surface area contraction, not a height contraction. And so basically what they're saying is with the surface area contracting of the amount of clouds related to storms, more sunlight's getting through than normally would. Cloud height contraction does not figure in at all.
Thanks a lot. That's great.
Okay, thank you. I'm not sure what this is referring to either, but I'll ask it anyway. Guffpot asks, wasn't it Richard Lindzen who put forward a clout iris hypothesis? I think they might mean
the iris hypothesis. That was Professor Lindzen's really imaginative, really brilliant idea. But what he pointed out is that one of the major ways that clouds affect temperature is that high cirrus clouds, which form, say, at the top of thunderstorms or hurricanes. You can see them going out at very, very high altitudes, right up in the stratosphere. They hinder the cooling of the Earth because the cloud little particulates of ice are cold, and so they don't radiate efficiently. And so Professor Lindzen's iris hypothesis was that as the Earth tries to warm up, it releases this water vapor at lower altitudes, so you don't form as many iris clouds. I'm being oversimplified. I hope Dick will forgive me if I'm if he's watching this. But that's the basic idea. So it would be a very strong negative feedback mechanism. And the word iris is like with your eyes, you know, when you look at bright light, then the little holes in your eyes close, the iris is closed down to keep you from getting too much light back onto your retina. So this was the idea that the Earth itself and the atmosphere had this iris-like response to trying to get more more surface temperature. You know, that it would react in such a way, in a negative feedback way. And you know, the good thing about that is that if you look at other natural processes that we understand very well, and not much controversy about them, almost all of them are negative feedback. So climate was always very strange in that it had to assume positive feedbacks to the effects of greenhouse gases to get enough effect to scare anyone. And everyone scratched their head, you know, positive feedback, isn't that strange? Doesn't that violate Le Chatelier's principle, for example, which is a observation that almost all feedbacks in nature are negative. So Dick was his intuitions were 100% correct.
I think I saw a question earlier about asking, could we give examples of the feedbacks? And the ones that they use in the climate models have to do with, the warming creates more water vapor, which adds to the warming effect. Warming melts the permafrost, which releases methane, which adds to the warming effect. All these things are built into models, but they don't understand how much methane or whether there's that feedback mechanism. They don't understand how water vapor. They built in assumptions about certain kinds of responses of the environment to CO2 that aren't justified based on observation. And that's why one of the reasons I think the models run way too hot.
Yeah, Sterling is right. The most cited feedback is the water vapor that he mentioned, that, you know, if you warm the surface, you'll get more water vapor at higher altitudes, and it's colder there, so it won't radiate as efficiently. And so the Earth will have to get warmer to make up for that. That was what won the Nobel Prize for Manabe, you know, this water vapor feedback. But the problem with it is that when it assumes that the relative humidity remains constant, and so the humidity should be going up at high altitudes. But none of the observations have supported that. So the absolutely essential part of that theory, this positive feedback theory, is that there's a lot more water vapor at higher altitudes as the Earth warms up, and that's not happening. In fact, if anything, it's going down. It's not going the right direction. You know, there's a joke in theoretical physics: getting the sign right is the hardest thing, and this is a good example of it.
Yeah, and thank you, David, for this question. That was a good one for us to launch, especially with the positive or negative feedback kind of theme that we are developing here, because we actually have another question. This is from one of our viewers on X. Raffaele, I think his name is pronounced, asks, is there any quick explanation about why the Earth won't end up like Venus with its nightmarish atmosphere?
Well, we could wind up like Venus if we could figure out how to make our orbit closer to the sun. You know, Venus is only 0.7 astronomical units, the radius of the Earth, so it gets twice as much sunlight. So the reason Venus has these hellish conditions is not because of CO2. That's a result of being close to the sun. It didn't cause the CO2. You know, so for example, if the Earth were at the orbit of Venus, we would quickly lose the water from the oceans, you know, because it would go to high altitude, the hydrogen would be lost to space. And so we wouldn't have any more water to moderate. And so all of a sudden the surface will be dry. And then you've got thousands of meters of limestone, which would bake out, you know, like in a lime kiln. So you should think of Venus as a cosmic lime kiln. You know, it's baking out all the carbonate that on Earth is limestone in Mammoth Cave or Carlsbad Caverns, but on Venus, it's all in the air. atmosphere of Venus, it's 80 atmospheres. There's a huge amount of CO2 in the atmosphere of Venus, but it's because it's closer to the sun. We're not going to go closer to the sun.
Yeah, hopefully. That would be very unfortunate. Okay. Let's see. Here's another kind of feedback question. This is from Polly, who says, isn't it true that warmer climate causes more evaporation of seawater, which forms clouds, and then clouds are acting as a sunshade and causes cooling?
Yeah, I think that's true. So, all of these things, the issue is quantitatively how much. But the basic observation is true that warmer clouds cause more evaporation, and they form low clouds. Low clouds are really good at cooling the earth because they reflect sunlight back to space before it gets a chance to turn into heat. I mentioned that high clouds are just the opposite. That was the essential part of Dick Lindzen's iris effect. But low clouds are definitely cooling. And so this is probably happening. Nobody knows how much yet. But, if we weren't so fixated on greenhouse gases, we would probably know the answer to that question by now. But hopefully we'll reform and get the science right.
Absolutely.
I would point out that we see this process of heating causing more evaporation, causing more clouds, and then cooling happening every day in the intertropical convergence zone along Earth's equator. We have thunderstorms that build up in the afternoon after the sun's surface gets heated up by this, or the water surface gets heated up by the sun. And so we get the convection going up and the thunderstorms forming and them spreading out and then acting as a sunshade. This process happens every day, and it's part of the natural regulating mechanism that Earth has to keep its temperature balanced.
Yeah, Anthony's right. It's too bad that every citizen doesn't have a chance, for example, to visit equatorial regions and see this intertropical convergence. I saw it as a kid because I was born in India, and we got it every year as the southwest monsoon, when the intertropical convergence zone crossed the Indian subcontinent, and there's a lot of clouds and a lot of rain.
Here's a question from DJ Bo over on Rumble. Thank you, DJ, who says, in the 70s, global cooling was in part due to particulate pollution. Does China's temperature record show cooling given their lousy air quality? That's a good question.
Well, I honestly haven't followed China's temperature record. When 10 years ago, when I used to visit China, they had a serious pollution problem, but even then it was beginning to get a little bit better. It wasn't all from coal, for example. It's their custom around Shanghai, which I was visiting. At the end of the rice harvest, you burn all the fields. And so there was enormous amounts of smoke from this customary burning of the fields. And then, China is just downwind from the Gobi Desert, which is this enormous source of dust. And so they've been getting particulate pollution forever. I mean, Marco Polo described it very clearly. And so that's not their fault. They happen to be living downwind from the Gobi Desert. So you have to cope with that. But I don't know the answer to the question. It's a good question.
Yeah, I'm not sure that we have all that much access to data out of China, at least not on ground sensors, I would imagine.
Well, I think they're pretty open.
We've seen some studies that showed China's cities are warming, and that came out of the Climate Research Unit over in England. Phil Jones produced a paper on that. But I would point out that it's kind of a double-edged sword. China's infrastructure has been growing dramatically. The cities have been expanding dramatically. And so the UHI effect is also expanding dramatically. And so that might kind of balance out the pollution thing. We've got less sunlight coming in, but we've got more concrete and asphalt to keep the temperature high at night because it absorbs what sunlight is there. So it's a really tough question to answer.
Yep. Agreed.
All right. Here's a question from SRB, who says, would you ask Dr. Happer to discuss the Le Chatelier principle? in the context of the so-called tipping point?
Yeah, well, okay. Le Chatelier's principle says that most natural processes are such that if you change something like the temperature, the object of this change will try to do something to oppose the change in one way or another. So, and that you would call negative feedback. And most things are like that you're familiar with. For example, if you put a pot of water on the stove and you turn on the stove, it'll get hot until it starts to boil. And at that point, it no longer gets any hotter. And it's resisting getting hotter by releasing steam. So it's releasing all of that heat from the flame of gas underneath it into latent heat of the steam coming off the pot. And so that's a dramatic example of Le Chatelier's principle. That's a natural thing. You don't have to pay an engineer to make it do that. It'll do it itself. And and there are many other processes of various types. And there are a few that do have positive feedback. And that's related to this tipping point question. So one example is a high explosive, and you can make chemical high explosives. And there, if you perturb a stick of dynamite with enough influence, with a blasting cap, you get positive feedback. And so the little shock wave from the cap actually gets amplified, strong positive feedback, and the dynamite stick blows up, and hopefully for some useful purposes. So we're very careful with chemicals, and there are a few of them that you have to be careful with like that have positive feedback or potential positive feedback, and can lead to tipping points like blowing up. And the reason is that any misstep, it will blow up. If there's a tipping point, it will tip. Okay, and so now, what about the Earth's climate? Suppose it has tipping points. Well, the Earth has been around for 4.5 billion years. There's not the slightest evidence in the geological record that the Earth has ever tipped. Its climate has ever tipped. It's gone through lots of dramatic changes, but none of them like the tipping point that climate extremists talk about. So it's probably not there. It's probable that the Earth's atmosphere is just like other natural systems, that the feedbacks are negative, and the predictions, zeroth order projections without any feedback, are probably predicting too much warming, not too little warming. That would be what you would expect a priori.
I think certainly we have no evidence in our geologic history of ticking points related to CO₂ levels, since CO₂ levels have been 5,000 parts per million at times in the past and more. And we had neither snowball Earth or runaway hot house Earth. And Dr. Happer can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that Dr. Lindzen's iris effect is one of those Chatelier responses.
Absolutely. It's 100% Le Chatelier. Yeah.
Alrighty. Here, this is a question from one of our very frequent viewers, Chris Nisbet, who says, what does Will think of the UK's chances of being able to dim the sun and the wisdom of even trying?
Well, I guess this is a question about geoengineering. There are all these folks wandering around offering to solve a non-existent problem by making real problems, filling the stratosphere with sulfates. So it's a dumb idea. I mean, even the UK, that's not dumb enough to do that.
Yeah, it's a good plot for a James Bond film, but not for real life.
All they'd have to do is reopen all their old dirty coal plants. Remember, there was a time when coal plants were putting a lot of pollution, not modern plants, but plants from the 40s and 50s. That's all they'd have to do.
Well, it's a little different, Sterling. These geoengineers want to release the sulfates into the stratosphere, so it'll be like, Tambora, or one of these Southeast Asian volcanoes, that calls the year without a summer. So that's their aim. So it would probably work, but just to do that, you couldn't afford to do it. The energy that went into these super volcanoes, we couldn't afford the cost of putting all that sulfate. And of course, it's a stupid idea to begin with. Why would anyone want to do that?
Right.
It's pretty amazing. Okay. Here's a question from Ray W. And I think both you and Anthony can probably answer this one, and maybe Sterling as well. At what percentage does CO2 of CO2 in the atmosphere does it actually become bad? For
science from movies.
Life. Yeah, let me have a stab at it, and others will jump in. But I think 3% is not a bad guess, because when people ask me this, I say when it's about the same as the exhale breath, and your exhale breath is typically 4%, 5% CO2, depending on how hard you've been exercising. And so 3% is getting close to where you're a little worried about it, because your lung has to get the CO2 from your blood out and into the air, and that's easiest if the air is less than 4%. And so, in submarines, we've done lots of studies, because we have crews underwater for 3 months at a time in the North Pacific, and they limit CO2 levels in submarines to 5,000 parts per million, which is much less than 3%. At those levels, you can't see any effect at all on the crew. So there's no way there's going to be enough fossil fuel to put that into the Earth's atmosphere. There's too much atmosphere. But maybe some others would like to comment.
Yeah. I would like to point out, I just had some quick calculations done here asking what percentage, if we had 3% of the atmosphere as carbon dioxide, how many parts per million would that end up being? And the math works out to be 30,000 parts per million. Well, people start getting headaches and getting lethargic at 5,000 parts per million. So at 3%, we'd all be dead.
Yeah.
The safety,
that would be...
the safety margin for submarines and things like that is about 5,000 parts per million, which is 10 times, more than 10 times where we are today. A doubling of CO2 has no impact on human health at all from current levels or from, pre-industrial levels.
I might say you can get too little CO2. That's what happens when you hyperventilate, because your lung is putting too much CO2 out of your blood. And the result is that your blood starts getting more and more alkaline because the CO2, the carbonic acid, is keeping the pH at something that your body likes. And the same with the oceans. If it weren't for the CO2 in the ocean would be a pH about like ammonia, 11 or 11 and a half. So thank God for CO2 in the world. And in many places, our own bodies in the ocean, we need it.
All right. Here's a question from Tech, who says, any updates on albedo effect measurements or good historical proxies?
Well, I'm really not the person to answer that, but we do have lots of satellites that are doing their best to measure albedo series, for example. And I don't follow that carefully, but you do observe changes, and there have been some albedo changes. One of the ways that people have measured it is looking at Earthshine on the moon. So if you look at the dark side of the moon, it's not fully dark. There's a little bit of light that's been reflected from the Earth, including reflected from clouds. So the main effect on Earth's albedo is the amount of cloud cover there is. And so these studies of the dark of the moon have shown some decrease of the albedo, which is consistent with the idea that we were getting fewer and fewer clouds that we've discussed earlier in this program. And that's been a major part of the observed warming. The warming hasn't been very much, but it's been there. And whatever it is, it's not CO2. CO2 is not capable of causing the warming that we've seen. It causes a little, but not what we've seen.
Let's see. We've got a lot of really good questions today, you guys. And so I just wanted to thank the audience for a second here, because you guys are killing it, actually. This is a bit of a challenging question, Dr. Happer, from Ron Bertie, who says, Malin Baker has a page on YouTube trying to debunk Dr. Happer's argument about the value of saturation. Is Dr. Happer aware of this criticism? And if he is, what's his response?
Well, you know, I'm constantly being criticized, and Abraham Lincoln once said, you know, if I were to respond to every criticism, I wouldn't have time to do my job. So I'm not familiar with it, but there's not the slightest doubt that CO2 is heavily saturated. Even the climate community knows that. I recommend, if you haven't read it, there's a nice paper by Rasul and Steve Schneider from the year 1971, when people were worried about the next ice age. And Steve Schneider, for those who don't know, later became a leading global warming advocate. He went to Stanford, became a distinguished professor, but he made his career early on by being alarmed about global cooling. And so he wrote a very good paper talking about what is the possibility that we could save the Earth from the next ice age by adding CO2. And the paper points out that because of saturation, the very same word that I'm using now, you know, CO2 is not a very effective greenhouse gas, and it's not possible for it to save us from the next ice age. So I recommend that you read Rasul and Schneider and make up your own mind. Yeah.
Absolutely. All right. We're running a bit over time, so we're just going to pick another couple of questions here. Let me see if I can find a lighter one for us for a second here, other than K1's question, which is, what is the airspeed velocity of an unladen swallow? A very good question that nobody knows.
We had to answer that question in physics in college.
Is that an African swallow or a European swallow?
Very good.
That's exactly right. We answered this in the chat, but I'll pull it up anyway. Wayne asks, is Dr. Happer's paper available to the public?
Oh yeah, there are lots of sites you can download it. Go to the website of the CO₂ Coalition and you'll find it there.
Yeah.
And we also have it in the description of this broadcast.
Okay, thanks very much.
Alrighty. Let's see. Okay, well, there's a question for me here, so I guess I can take that real quick, and then we'll do some more science ones. Racer Dave says, I'm an old fart like Sterling, sorry. Are you seeing your messages resonate with people in your age demographic, and how can we reach more? Yes and no. It depends. It really does depend. My age demographic is kind of like the tail end of millennials, I think. If they're a little bit reticent to talk about it, you know. It's not one of those things that my generation, even on the conservative side, has like latched onto as something that needs to be fought. A lot of people my age, especially, you know, even on the right, kind of pay lip service to climate issues. But I think it's because of what Dr. Happer said earlier. I mean, all of us were raised, you know, forever on the belief that, you know, you trust what the scientists tell you. At least when I was in school, we watched An Inconvenient Truth like twice over the course of 3 or 4 years, and Gasland multiple times. And so, you know, it's been hammered into us since we were little kids. So it is going to be hard to break through that. I noticed that one of our frequent viewers, Energy Colonizer, pointed out that ridicule is something that's very effective against a lot of people on the left, or a lot of ideas that, deserve ridicule. And so the idea that we're like hurtling towards catastrophe is becoming increasingly something that we're making fun of, or we're seeing people kind of make light of, in conservative circles in particular. And even some on the left saying, well, obviously they don't, the John Kerrys and stuff of the world don't care all that much because, like Sterling pointed out, they're jetting around. So, even some of my peers who are a little bit more left-leaning kind of, roll their eyes at that a bit. And there's a lot of things that are more immediate that we're worried about. People in like Gen Z, I think it's a coin flip. It seems to be that a lot of young men of that generation are more conservative than previous generations, but the women definitely are not. So I think it's questionable.
That it was Winston Churchill, I think, that had a saying: "If you're not liberal when you're young, you have no heart. If you're still liberal when you're old, you have no brain."
Yeah,
I think a lot of these people who are true believers in their youth might become a bit more skeptical as they get older and have more experience with the world.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And Sterling, just as your comfort here, Paulie says Sterling isn't that old. So, some of us are older than dirt because our audience likes to insult.
I'm sure I'm a lot older than Sterling.
Jokingly, with love.
Most days I don't feel that old, but I took to a batting cage earlier this week, and I did not distinguish myself. It was pretty disappointing.
Oh, you distinguished yourself, just not the way you'd planned. That's all.
Well, that's true.
All right. Let's see. Oh, Michael Johansson says Happer is emeritus. I'm sorry, I can't. Emeritus. Yeah. All right, but is very active. See, this is what happens when you read a lot, but you don't like watch and listen to stuff a lot. You can't pronounce anything. Okay. Are you still at the university, or how does that work?
Oh, yes, thank you very much. I'm actually sitting in my office at Princeton University in the Department of Physics. And so I will say for the university administration, at least on this issue, they've been absolutely solid. They get letters from time to time from irate alumni demanding that I be fired for speaking out on climate. And they get a return letter saying, go to hell. So I have a lot of respect for at least how they've treated me. And when you retire here, they let you keep your office. And so I'm in my office. I have a nice computer screen that I'm looking at now. And if it breaks, I can go down the hall and find a computer expert and they'll help me fix it.
Excellent. Thank you very much. That's so good. Alrighty. Well, you know what? We talked a little bit about this earlier, but so a lot of the time what we hear is that the climate models don't know what to do with clouds. And so are the models using cloud cover as a net negative feedback?
I don't know the details of the models, but the models, I'm sure you know, they have dozens of parameters in them that you have to tweak. When you first turn the model on, it doesn't give answers that look at all like the Earth's weather or climate or anything. And so you turn this knob down and make this parameter a little bigger until it sort of looks reasonable. And then you think that you have got predictive power, but it's really not. It's a attempt to do curve fitting. Yeah. So I don't know what they do with clouds. It's, that it is really true that low clouds cool the Earth. There's no question about that. And it's probably also true that these high cirrus clouds warm it. And so they've done everything in their power to pretend that most of the changes in cloud are to make more cirrus, and that would be a positive feedback, a warming effect. As I've said, I don't think there's the slightest evidence that is happening. But the honest answer is I don't know what they put in these days.
if you look at what the IPCC says when they talk about the variables that impact climate change, they're honest in that they say we don't understand clouds very well, and that means the computer models they rely on don't understand clouds very well. They don't. I think the last time I saw, it could have a positive effect or a negative effect. That's the range. But they're convinced that whether it's a positive or a negative effect, it's a small effect. The only thing that really has a critical effect is CO2 and other greenhouse gases. Ocean currents, we don't understand them very well, but we're sure they don't have a major effect. Volcanoes, we really don't understand them, but we're sure they don't have a major effect. The only thing that has the major effect, according to the IPCC, is CO2 and other greenhouse gases.
Thanks, Sterling. And of course, that's completely wrong.
Of course. Yeah. The sun. We don't understand the sun, but we're pretty sure it has minimal effect.
All right. So we're going to end this on a fun question here from Ray, who says, in history, who is Will's favorite scientist and why?
Well, I guess in recent history, my favorite scientist was Enrico Fermi. He was an Italian physicist who was involved in early days of nuclear physics, who came to America during World War II, was a major figure in the Manhattan Project, but was just extremely creative. You know, it's probably too nerdy to get into the details of why, but for example, one of the first things he did was to explain the spectrum of CO2. CO2 absorption with infrared is rather peculiar, you know, and so he pointed out this was because of a quantum mechanical resonance in the CO2 molecule, and it turned out many other molecules were the same way, but people still talk about Fermi resonances, and some of them try to pretend that that's important for climate. It's almost irrelevant, but Fermi's my hero.
Awesome. Well, that's going to be it for the Q&A portion, guys. Sorry to the ones we couldn't get to. You guys had so many good questions. I tried to pick the ones that were the most specific and clear on the topic at hand, but thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
Yes, and thank you, Will Happer, and for being on the show. It was so great. Your second time. We're definitely going to have you on again. This is probably our longest show ever, and it was just because there were so many great questions from so many great members of the audience to speak to somebody who is so prestigious. I want to thank our streaming partners that help us bring this show to the world every week. Junk Science, CFACT, the CO₂ Coalition, of which Will Happer is affiliated, Climate Depot, What's Up With That, and Heartland UK Europe. Thanks to our producers in the background, Ian and Keeley. I want to urge you all to visit climaterealism.com, where you get the counterspin to climate alarmism every single day. climateataglance.com, where you get the data you need to counter climate alarmism. Also, Energy at a Glance, and always visit heartland.org, where you can subscribe to our Climate Change Weekly newsletter produced by our very own Sterling Burnett. Thank you again, audience, for being here, for watching and listening, and we will talk to you next Friday. Bye-bye.